What's up, everyone? Welcome to Simulation. I'm your host, Alan Sakyan. Very excited to be talking about our public responsibility to educate children. We have Carol Kocivar joining us on the show. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for coming on. Really appreciate it. And it was so nice first meeting you when we did the panel on school choice with the Libertarian Party of San Francisco. That was very nice. You were teaching me so much about the complexity of what actually goes on for this. You know, there's vouchers, there's charter schools, there's public schools, there's how to fund those. There's getting parents informed and involved in their child's education. There's so much complexity, and I was so grateful that we got to meet, and now we get this longer one-on-one conversation. Carol's background, for those that don't know, Carol is the former past president of the California State PTA. She is also a former journalist, an attorney, and ombudsperson for special education. She's currently the host of Looking at Education on KALW 91.7 FM, and also a writer for Ed 100, which is a web resource for informed parents, to inform parents on how schools systems work and how to get the children of these beautiful kids into just better education. It's our public responsibility to educate children. So let's ask Carol, on a big history perspective of civilization. We find ourselves as stewards of Earth. We have this reproduction cycle where we have offspring, and then we have to educate the offspring on the collective learning. And so as we kind of water these seeds and figure out exactly what nutrients to give them, how do you see that synthesis on how to best do that?
Well, you started with an easy question, right?
Yeah.
But I think that every generation has a responsibility to educate their children. And some of those things are the same regardless of what generation we are, because we need to help our kids understand the world they're living in. We need to give them the skills to negotiate and navigate how that world works. We have to provide them with the love and nurturing and understanding that makes them understand the importance of education. And I think particularly in the United States, part of public education is our responsibility to creating and protecting civics in our democracy. And I think that's a very, very important role. So when we talk about education, we're not just talking about, could you do geometry, could you do algebra, did you learn French, did you learn Chinese, or whatever it is. We're talking about giving our children the skills that they need to be responsible citizens. And that, I've always felt that there are more things that we have to include in education. I've been a huge supporter of making sure that our kids get arts, because arts are how kids learn. If you look at a young child, they automatically move with music. They automatically draw. It opens their imagination. And that's something that we should make sure that's included throughout a child's education. So that's sort of a broad answer to your question.
The seeds are being molded and given nutrients into the world, and there's to understand the world that they live in, like you were indicating, and then we dance with music, we play with art. These are kind of these natural humanities that we love and so enjoy, and when funding gets cut from those areas, we become less human in some ways. And how long has it been now for advocating for bettering education for you?
Do we have a long time to talk about it? Well, since my kids were in public school in San Francisco, and both of my kids have now graduated and are working and are self-sufficient. So it's been at least a generation of watching how our education system works, and what are those major components that we need to continue to be successful. I got into education advocacy in a very simple way, and lots of parents get into it in a very similar way. When my kids were in elementary school, we had a teacher who was the arts teacher. And I thought, wow, that's terrific, we have an arts teacher. But it turned out that the parents had to pay for that arts teacher. And I said, there's something pretty inequitable and wrong where one school can have parents who can reach into their pockets, and there's enough in those pockets to pay for an arts teacher, and other schools don't have it. And we really have to make sure that we meet the needs of all of our children. And so that was one of the things that started me on the journey in San Francisco, and I became a very huge advocate for arts education in our schools. We've done something terrific in San Francisco, and that is that the city realized its responsibility to our children. And we now have a portion of the city budget that helps pay for things that a lot of school districts don't have. We have money that goes to pay for librarians. We have money that goes to pay for physical education. We have money that goes to pay for the arts. And that's because we have, I believe, a very, very responsible citizenry in San Francisco, where they recognize that there's not just the public schools and the city. It's all of us together looking out for children. And when we talk about the education of our children, we can't forget what are the life circumstances of our children. So is the child in foster care? Yeah. Does the child, is a child a learner of a second language? Does the child have a home? Yeah. What are the health circumstances of a child? And so we have to roll in all of our community to make sure that we meet the needs of a child. You're highlighting something that's so important, all of the variables that go into the seed, because there may not be both parents present, there may only be one parent present, there may be no parents present, there may be some sort of other trauma or some sort of drug use in the family, or whatever it may be that is causing some sort of trauma on the child's life, and the community is again helping provide resources for libraries, arts, the things that are gonna help make sure that the seed gets the right nutrients. And so this is so important that it's also good that you actually had like you said, a whole generation of working with your children going through the San Francisco public schools and being able to kind of pick apart and help better the education system. Now, as you're doing that, that's kind of like a bit on this importance of early childhood education, and you can probably speak more to this as I ask this question, but what were those key things that you found in bettering education that were kind of missing? You started pointing at humanities, the arts, the libraries, the different SES socioeconomic statuses. Right. Well, I think you mentioned something that's more and more people recognize as important, and that is making sure that our children, not only who are like 3, 4, and 5, but making sure that our children birth to 5 have the supports that they need to be successful. We talk a lot about something called the achievement gap, and I look at it really as an opportunity gap, because if a child doesn't have the opportunity to learn and work with others in a preschool, if a child doesn't have parents who have the experience of talking and reading to a child, there's certain things that we know help children. And if the children don't have it, it's not the child's fault. The child is not a deficit in any way. It's our failure to help that child. And so when we look at the highly successful school systems in the nation, they've put money into early childhood education. Mm-hmm. They've put money into making sure our 3- and 4-year-olds have the experiences that they need. And so we have to look at the whole continuum of education. Education doesn't start at kindergarten.
Yeah.
And one of the things that always bothers me.
It doesn't end at college.
It doesn't end at college either. But one of the things that always bothers me is, how do people measure how successful a school is? And some people measure how successful a school is just on
test scores.
Test scores. Are the kids doing well in test scores? But there's been a lot of research about in California, and schools that serve low-income children, English language learners, those schools actually, in terms of helping a child move a whole grade level, are more successful than the high achieving schools. Because I believe that if you have moved a child more than a year in a year, wow, that is fantastic. But if you're just going year to year, that's not as much success. Yeah. And so we have a lot of schools in California who are actually doing that yeoman's work of really helping our kids.
And this is, you know, we also briefly talked about this before the show as well, but it's very exciting to see the new sort of like Montessori's come up, and the new like We Grows, and all these different even like wilderness schools that are, you know, coming into play. And it seems as though that the period between this early childhood neuroscience indicates that if you do have some sort of traumas in your families from even, you know, 0 to 6 months of age, that it's going to have some long-term effects that society we're going to have to deal with. So it's also a philosophy of just informing adults, like, just don't have like out of not even wedlock, but out of whatever civil union or out of planned birth, and because that can lead to significant traumas with children. Make sure that you're financially able, that you're mentally able, that exactly you're emotionally able, you're time able, all that kind of stuff. And then we, you know, this is only what we're talking about with like early childhood stuff is in arts and humanities. This is part of the equation, and then the other part of, like, I guess in a sense, right now, how we fund schools is property tax.
Well, property tax, and this in some states, the state uses their personal income tax.
Okay,
so it's a combination. But you've hit on something, and I think that we're at a tipping point in public education, because if you look at what's been happening around the nation, we have had teachers standing up and saying, we can't do this anymore. And it's not just about teachers not being paid enough, and they aren't paid enough.
That is so true, yes.
But it is also about making sure that they have the support that they need for the kids, making sure that there's small class size, making sure that there are counselors, asking for nurses, providing all the things that the school districts and states that have a lot of money are providing for our kids. And so what I see happening in California, you know, we've had this in Los Angeles, we're having it in Oakland. I would anticipate that we're going to be seeing more and more of these issues about funding, and it really talks to, when we talk about our responsibility to our children, is the state investing what it should be investing for our kids? So if we look at California, for example, and you talked about property taxes, and we'll get a little wonky, but essentially what happens is they've tried to make it so that all of the school districts get a base amount, regardless of whether or not they're able to raise a lot or a little bit in property taxes. Because if they're not able to raise much, the state fills it in. So we have a base amount of money that all schools get.
And that helps fill the holes, like if there's not enough funding for arts and humanities, then that can fill
almost.
Almost.
The base amount isn't enough. But the other thing that we've done is we've moved to a system where we give more money to school districts that have children with higher needs. So if you have a lot of kids who are in poverty, if you have a lot of kids who are English learners, if you have kids who are in foster care, those kids generate more money for their school district, because we know those kids require more services. And I think that's a very smart thing to do. But regardless of how smart we are in how we divvy up the pie in California is too small. So
for education.
For education.
Yeah.
Well, you could argue, you know, it may not be large enough for healthcare services and other things too.
Yeah,
but let's just talk for a moment about education. So where are we in California compared to the rest of the nation? We've had a lot of studies. And, you know, we're about 41st, 42nd, 43rd in the nation, depending on what study you look at. But 41st, 42nd, 43rd in the nation is way below the top 10 states in the nation.
But this is also a population of 40 million people.
That's right. But we have 40 million people, but we have to serve every individual child. Just because you live in a state that has a lot of kids doesn't mean your kids get less. They deserve the same level of education
as a 1 million person state.
And so when we look at California, and we're 41st in the nation, it would take about $35 billion more.
Damn.
Every year, $35 billion more every year to get us to the highest performing states. And so by any measure, we're not serving our children well. If we measure, for example, just how much money we invest. Well, if you don't invest enough money, it means you have the largest class size in the nation. If you don't invest enough money, you have the fewest counselors. If you don't invest enough money, you have the fewest nurses. If you don't invest enough money, you have what we're seeing all over California, and that teachers can't afford to live in the communities where they're teaching. So if you...
Neither can the police officers or firefighters or healthcare.
So if you compare, it used to be that teaching was a pretty stable, strong, middle-class job. And then over the years, what we've seen, because of diminished funding and teachers being laid off, it's not viewed of as a stable job. We've had a couple of other things that have affected teaching. Years and years ago, for very bright women, teaching was where you went. There were not other opportunities. And now women, who are the traditional people who are our teaching force, have a lot more opportunities. And those opportunities pay a lot more money. So if you looked at how much a teacher pays compared to someone who has equal education, teachers are significantly below people who have equal education. And that's counting their health services, that's counting their pensions. They are below what others can earn. So if you're looking at, well, will I go into teaching? Oh my gosh, you know.
Yeah, the decisions very quickly. I can't afford to live in the metro area where I'm teaching. This becomes, you gotta really be dedicated to wanting to help children to want to become a teacher. And the incentive systems are such an important part of this. You know, initially you mentioned this importance of like having $35 billion more per year
Right.
in order to be able to properly educate the children in the state of California. And what that could actually unleash would be very, very, very fascinating. It's the difference, like you were indicating, between a 30-student class size with one teacher versus a 10-student class size.
Well,
or
we're actually talking about class sizes that may be in the 40s compared to class sizes. All the research tells us that the best class size for K to 3 is about 18 kids.
18 kids.
18 kids. And so our class size, people today think they're lucky their class size is 28 and 30. That's not small class size. Oh, we're going to bring our class size down to 25. That is not small class size. If you look at the research where the kids get the individual attention that they need, 18 is about a really good class size. So, people have forgotten what it looks like. In California, we have lots of teachers who come in who have never, for example, experienced having arts in the schools because they grew up in a time when our schools didn't have arts. And so they're not used to doing that. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of helping our teachers being prepared to provide those services.
Yes. And then this also kind of, for me, brings up this question again, where we kind of started on this point, just about the complexity of how the schools work. There's public school options, there's private school options, there's charter school options, there's school vouchers, there's so this is very there's lottery systems, right? So the lottery system in San Francisco was because we were trying to make it so that the low SES and high SES weren't so drastically separated, and we were trying to give more opportunities to low SES. A voucher system, you could get a part of the school's tuition compensated through a government voucher, but you're against vouchers, and then how does all of that complicated, like informing the parents so that they also can understand what the best decisions are?
Well, I have a pretty strong philosophy that public money should pay for public schools, and that means that vouchers, pseudo vouchers like tax credits where you use public money to pay for private schools and religious schools, all of those things, I don't believe, go to support a robust, strong public education. And we've gone through, over the last several years, a whole effort by lots of forces that have essentially taken money away from public education. So not only are we not funding public education in California at the level that we should, but there are also forces that take money away from the existing pie that we have. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have a charter school that's created in your community that meets the needs within your community. But I have really serious issues about large companies coming in and making a profit out of and using public money to pay for it. And these are people who have essentially, in many ways, no experience in running education. They may have experience in making profits, but their experience and expertise is not in helping kids succeed in education.
Interesting. So this is like taking the public money of the voucher and giving it to a private organization, private school, a charter school, etc.
Well, a charter school is, in some ways, a public school. It gets public money.
It gets public money,
but when you look at
too, right?
When you look at vouchers, one of the things about vouchers is that the school gets to choose who goes to that school. A private school gets to choose who goes to that school. Not everyone can get into that school. So
low acceptance rates.
So it's a false premise that it's a choice. It's not the parent's choice, it's the choice of that private or religious school as to who will go there. But let's put vouchers aside and choice aside.
And just to give a ballpark estimate, some of these schools in San Francisco are like $25,000 a year.
Even more.
Something.
For you know, private schools are very expensive. But I think when we talk about education, we really know in our hearts what our kids need. But it is making sure that we have, as you talked about the seeds, making sure that our schools have all of those ingredients.
Ingredients to make the seeds sprout and blossom.
Right. And so let's talk about what are those things that make a successful school. It's well-trained teachers. It's well-supported administrators and superintendents. It's people who have the expertise in how to help all of our children. It's making sure that nurturing and supporting is at the basis of our philosophy of education. Education is not a race to the top. Education is about meeting the needs of the child who walks into your classroom and figuring out how to help that child.
Yeah, one of the ways that we were chatting about looking at it was a big race for test scores, a big race to fill in bubbles, and how can a child possibly be asked to comprehend critical thinking skills when they're malnourished or malsheltered or don't have the love and compassion from a parent in their lives? So there's the ingredients have to be there for the seed to be able to blossom in an educational system. Plus, the child's we're kind of also in a sense pushing all children through the same assembly line of language and history and math and science, and this is, of course, these are important fields, but there is also for the child to be exposed to what they most enjoy, and then for the child to be able to engage with what they most enjoy at a young age over and over, and practice and mold and create and do that process from a very young age can help them become that artist or entrepreneur down their life faster than if they could only start that when they're 23 and they're out of the collegiate system, and then they're like $200,000 in debt. I don't even know what I love doing. That's a disaster for education. And there's a lot of for-profit greed and gluttony that is also advocating for not changing the system from that.
So I'd like to talk a little bit, we've talked about some of the ingredients of making sure that we have a warm, nurturing environment, and teachers who are well paid, well trained, but we also have another component, right? We have parents.
Yes.
And so we have had I think a wonderful transition in our demographics of California, because we have now the rich, robust cultures of people from around the world who may not have had the experience of public education in California, or may not have graduated from high school here. And so how do we help those parents understand how the system works so that they know what does the research say? You know, I talked to you about what the research is on class size, but what does the research say? And our system here in California is a system where our whole community tries to make decisions on what's best for our kids. So we need to make sure that our parents understand the education system, why are the arts important, what are your opportunities for various things. And so I'd like to switch a little bit to something called Ed 100, which is an online resource that I've helped create with Jeff Camp, who is the tech guy and sort of the mastermind behind it. But I've been working on it, trying to help parents understand how the system works so they can stand up and be confident spokespeople for their kids.
And this is an interesting way to take a look at things, because you have this, short, plainly worded lessons explain how California school system really works. So this is as though you are taking and compacting, you're compressing down the important wisdoms from how the systems work in order to have the parents become more informed.
Right, and what usually when people talk about education, education is full of jargon. IEP, SST, all of these things, LCAFF, LCAP.
Yeah, when I saw those, I was like,
right, and people are like, oh my gosh, what the heck are you talking about?
And they have 2 jobs and they're trying to feed their kids.
And so this is written in short, easy lessons, so that, and we try to make it fun too, a little humor in it, so that you can spend a little bit of time learning about something. And so we have lessons. Remember, we were talking about school finance. Mm-hmm. Well, you could have an encyclopedia about how school finance works in California. Well, we have a chapter that has about 10 lessons where if you go through those lessons, you will understand how school finance works in California. And we also have a chapter, for example, of what's the right stuff? What should our school have? And it talks about the importance of the arts.
Yes.
Talks about social emotional learning.
Yes.
Talks about literacy. Talks about math. Mm-hmm. Talks about special education.
Yeah. Yeah, and then that way, as the parent becomes more informed, they can also identify that potentially the school lacks one of these areas that we need to address, or that I can better understand the process of how schools actually get the funding dollars they need, how the teachers do. What would be a good way for, this is ed100.org for those, the links in the bio for those that want to check it out. And this is for California school system, and this could also potentially go to like New York school system, et cetera.
The finance part is about California. Okay. But most of the other lessons, anyone can pick them up and read them and understand them.
That's great, yes, because then it becomes applicable to everyone on what should be the socio-emotional, et cetera, in the schools. Now, in terms of how to, in order to have the informed teachers, in order to have the properly funded teachers and administrators and all of these components, like these modules that you're talking about for school, how does the one get the increase in funding to be able to afford that?
I think one of the things that you have to do is create informed parents who will speak up and speak out about what's happening in our schools. It doesn't happen without a force. A crisis creates change. And I think if you look at what's happening in California, we have reached a crisis level in terms of funding our schools. We would not have teachers striking in communities throughout California and communities throughout the nation if we hadn't reached a sort of tipping point in saying, look guys, one of our most basic responsibilities as citizens is to educate our children. And we've gone through sort of a huge economic shift in our nation, where we have some people who have gobs of money but lots of people who don't have a lot of money. And we have to stand up and say, regardless of whether you're, you know, a multi-millionaire or someone who has just come to California and doesn't speak English, we have a responsibility to educate all of our children and meet the needs of all of our children. And so we have to speak up and speak out, and it is unending pressure on our elected officials that has them look in the face of our children and look in the face of our teachers and ask them, are we doing the right thing? One of the things that elected officials are afraid of, it's a 3-letter word, and it's called tax.
Tax.
It's called tax.
Yeah, yeah.
And we have to get past that, because we will not reach and meet the needs of our children unless we all chip in.
And
all of us
that creates
chip in.
more issues when the children don't have the needs met. In the communities, that creates more issues. Yeah, all chipping in. Ron, I want to hear your thoughts on crisis creates change. I know you like that phrase.
I really have, you know, no comment, because, you know, educating children, you know, it always goes back to the parents, because there's parents that believe in some stuff that may not be in the developing child's best interest, but they want to instill these beliefs, these things that they believe are true, but may not necessarily be. So that's problematic in itself. But the institution of education, you know, there has been a system where, you know, that the rich and the poor, you know, we need poor people. We don't want to educate creative children. We want to just create obedient workers. So we have to just move on from that system. And there's something also in charge of that that's well aware of what they're doing. So I'm kind of hard pressed. Homeschooling is an option for a lot of people these days, I hear too. But those homeschoolers are the parents that I was talking about earlier, the parents that believe in crazy stuff, and I don't want to get too deep into that.
Well, that's one of the reasons, and it's not just to address crazy stuff, but that's one of the reasons we created Ed 100, so that parents could have a place to go that's reliable, trustworthy, real facts,
and compressed.
And where there's a this side and a that side, we put in the research for this side and a that side. But if there's any sense of telling people a point of view, it's making sure that people understand what the funding is like and what our children are missing by having a funding system here in California that is inadequate. And it's not just you look at the numbers. I mean, if your kids are getting half as much as kids in other states, that would be okay if your kids were doing well, right? But if we look at national statistics about how well our kids are doing compared to kids who are in well-funded education systems, they're not doing well. They're not doing well. And so we have this combination of kids not having the supports that they need, and as a result, not doing as well as we would hope that they could do. And it's research. I mean, we have to look at the research and what do we know helps our kids.
This is a good segue into talking about sleep and talking about later start times. You know, what is the literature saying about having Are you guys also sending parents these compressed ideas that get your kids to sleep? Get them to sleep their 7 hours that they need in their.
Actually, high school kids need about 9 hours.
Is it nine
of sleep.
for youth,
Yeah.
and then it goes down to 8-ish for adults?
So there's been a tremendous amount of research in the last couple of years about the importance of sleep, particularly for middle and high school kids. And the research is so profound that kids need more sleep that the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Centers for Disease Control have looked at those adolescents and said, hold it a second, these kids are not getting enough sleep. And they're recommending that middle and high schools not start before 8:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
Because there's a whole lot of science behind it, but essentially their bodies change when they get into adolescence, and they stay up late until 11 o'clock at night. They can't fall asleep. You could tell them, go to sleep, fall asleep, but their bodies don't let them fall asleep. And so there's a big push, which I support wholeheartedly, of making sure that our kids get enough sleep. And that's one of the things we should follow the science, follow the research. When we have this overwhelming research that says if kids don't get enough sleep, they don't do well in school, they have emotional, depressive challenges, they get into car accidents because they're drowsy. There are whole bunches of reasons why, and they fall asleep in class, right?
And now the information overload comes from the devices that are right by their bedsides when they wake up and when they go to sleep. And then that also prevents a lot of not only sleep at night, but also wake up in the morning and not even giving the brain the space to creatively just be in the space that they're in, but it's immediately going on to online. And what percentage of those conversations that are happening online are actually meaningful, are actually intellectually stimulating, versus just keeping a streak?
Right. There was just a study in Seattle where they moved their time back in their middle and high schools, and they could document it, that the kids do better. And in California, there's a big movement. There's a bill, it's SB 328, which is saying, you know, let's look at the science. Let's make sure that all of our kids have the opportunity to go to school at a time that meets their physical needs.
Yeah, and however it can also be best for working parents to be able to pass time with their kids in the evenings as well, and get their kids in the mornings. This has been extremely wide-ranging. I think maybe another important piece just to tap on at the end is I'm really starting to feel that there may be some sort of a bifurcation happening in the education of children, in the sense of things like Montessori schools, things like you know, We Grow, We's new, We Work's new program. It's just this. It seems as though that these new styles of they're kind of old. They're old styles that are being rebirthed, really, in educating children. And it seems to be that if it's going to be socioeconomically non-feasible, that this is a difficult thing for us to deal with.
Well, there's a huge push, and they have all these words. They call it social emotional learning. They call it whole child. But it is about meeting the child where the child is and providing the child with community resources when the child needs community resources. You talk about Montessori. Montessori is a very old historic way of teaching. My experience with Montessori is my son went to Montessori. He thrived in it. I thought it was a wonderful preschool environment. where kids get to decide what's important. They can do independent things. It's a wonderful way of responding to how young children learn.
And those skills translate for the rest of their life. Yeah.
And as we started out, is the skills that we're looking for in our graduates. You know, when these tech companies look at who they're going to hire, they don't just look at what their test scores are.
Totally.
They look to see, did they take art? Did they take music?
Yeah.
Are they innovative? How do they think?
Yes.
And the other thing, you know, that people look for is, do you play well with others?
Do you play well?
Do you play well with others?
How do you collaborate?
And so when we talk about social emotional learning, we talk about community schools, that's really those important things that we're trying to get our children to be able to respond well, so that they can be responsible citizens in a democracy.
Yeah. This is why you're a major proponent for civics and for getting young kids on the social emotional train as well, especially as we enter the age of exponentials and we see more and more robotics and artificial intelligence come in, that there is a greater and greater need for the social emotional skills as well.
If there's one other thing that I can add, I don't know how much time we have left.
Yeah, I have a couple quick questions on the way out. Go ahead.
But one of the things that I think is very important, and it talks about building responsibility, is having kids have lessons and work in the community that ties to their lessons. People call it service learning.
That's good.
But it is the opportunity to connect what you're learning in school with what's happening in the outside world. Whether you're learning something in biology and you
go to garden,
you do some gardens, and also making that connection to political voice.
Yeah, how to
and
make
so
change.
Knowing that it's not just biology, but if it's not working well in your community, having the confidence to speak up and say, you know what, we're not quite doing it right, I'd like to get involved.
I think a lot of that Socratic dialogue that happens between young kids, and we just had Michael Strong from the Academy of Thought and Industry on the show, and we really like that sort of idea of just dialogue that happens between kids on a specific topic, and then they get to engage the teacher maybe once a week, ask a question, get back to like talking about ideas and how they would build these ideas, and like you said, translating the conversations into community work and when I'm learning how to make that change. Okay, let's just do the quick couple questions on the way out. This is a simulation, so we must ask you, are we in a simulation?
No, this is real life. This is the most important thing that we do, and that is educating our children. It's not a simulation. This is the real thing, and we've got to get it right.
No matter what, we must get it right. Absolutely, that's true. Now, and we may even be tested on how well we can get this right.
And it may not be fill in the blanks either.
Yeah, that's right. And our last question is, what do you think is the most beautiful thing in the world?
Oh my goodness, besides sunsets, I think, and this is like from a mother, right? I think the most beautiful thing in the world is the first time you see your baby smile.
Yeah, there is something very precious about what's going on in the child's energy field when they're first looking at reality, and the smile, you're looking at their eyes, it's so precious.
And I'm not going to talk about how wonderful my grandchildren are, but I like them when they smile. Now you have
grandchildren too, so now you've had another round of seeing the smiles. Right. Oh, that's lucky. Yeah. San Francisco is I also had this very just strange vision that it could potentially be that like San Francisco gets so populated with like 20 to 30-year-olds that don't have kids, that the schools just disappear from the San Francisco area.
But I think the one thing about San Francisco is it's in our DNA to do the right thing. And we have had a history of making sure that we step in and try to help our community. We're a very, very democratic city, and people are not, there's a lot of political give and take, but the heart of San Francisco really is in the right place.
That's very well said, Carol. Thank you so much for coming on to the show and talking to us. This has been such a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, there's so much to still understand and unpack about how to best take on this responsibility of educating children into our world and all of the complex nuance that goes into it, all these modules that need to be involved and engaged, and parents needing to be engaged and informed. Everyone check out the links in the bio to Ed 100, as well as Carol's other work. Go and check that out. Everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. We greatly appreciate you. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Go and get talking in your communities about how to best educate, how to best nurture the minds that are being born into our world today. Shout out to Ron Vargas for producing and directing. Thank you very much. We love you. Thank you, thank you. And go and build, everyone. Support the artists and entrepreneurs that you believe in around the world. Go and support them and build the future, everyone. Manifest your dreams into the world. We love you so much, and we will see you soon. Peace.